You're listening to the Heavy Duty Parts Report. I'm your host, Jamie Irvin, and this is the show where you get expert advice about the heavy duty parts you buy and sell and keep you informed about what's happening in the industry. Our industry is being disrupted by new technology. Things are changing all the time. It's having an impact on the way parts are being distributed. Today, we are speaking with Daniel Simon and Kevin Smith from Dorman Products. Now, Dorman is a very large manufacturer of heavy-duty parts. They're a very large company. They actually work in automotive as well. And we're going to get some insight into what's changing in our industry and how, if you sell parts, how you can be more successful. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having us, Jamie. Really happy to be here.
Kevin, glad you could come too.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Absolutely appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad to be here.
So I'd like to throw the first question out to Daniel. What is a key driver of OE truck dealers holding such high market share when it comes to the replacement parts business?
Is this the only question for today? How much time do we have for that topic alone? Jamie, it's a really great question, and as I think there's really a number of drivers there. It's a pretty complex issue. But first, I'd say number one thing off the top of my head is it's probably just a lack of awareness. When I think back to Dorman Heavy Duty here, when we first entered the heavy duty aftermarket back in 2012. One of our first categories that at the time was dealer exclusive was forward lighting. So to think that just 8 years ago, headlights didn't exist in the aftermarket, really starts to put in perspective how quickly the number of product categories have expanded in the heavy duty space. The replacement parts category, moving away from just, maintenance, friction, fluids, et cetera, has really accelerated over the last 5-6 years. And I think the awareness in the aftermarket hasn't had a real chance to keep up. So we're constantly out there just driving awareness of the kind of categories that are out there in the heavy duty aftermarket, through our distributors, through our boots on the ground. And then, you look at just emerging parts categories too. 15 years ago, after treatment really didn't exist. And if we think about it in the tier 2 or say tier 3 fleet, it's really only been a spend in the last couple of years. And now it's really the number one spend for a lot of these fleets, up there with tires and fuel. So that's an emerging product category that if you think that, 8 years ago, forward lighting wasn't even available, certainly you're not going to expect that that sensors and knock sensors and modules and stuff like that are going to be available in the aftermarket. And then, tying on to that is just a sort of a bit of a knowledge gap here. These categories came in with an after treatment so quickly that the aftermarkets and independent service has really taken a bit of a time gap here to catch up. For a long time, I think there was a belief that you couldn't even do this work, that the work itself was dealer only, that it was a warranty problem, that you couldn't get access to diagnostics, et cetera. And companies like Diesel Laptops and Texa have really proven that there is dealer level diagnostic capabilities and programming capabilities available in the aftermarket. So that's really starting to change some of that as independent catches up with the abilities of the dealers to do that, what traditionally has been dealer level service. And then still one of, I think, the biggest problems or biggest challenges here is just inventory. When you look at, the fact that a truck now today in heavy duty is still effectively custom built from the ground up. When you have all the different vehicle, engine, after treatment options, the parts proliferation is just huge. So trying to predict all of these different sensor part categories and have the exact right parts available in a lower turning environment is a real challenge. And when you look at smaller fleets, owner-operators, and independent service channel, right, unlike a mega fleet, they can't afford to put a truck out of service for a couple days while they scour the world and the landscape for an aftermarket part. So, a lot of that spend is really going back to the OE dealer for parts just because the availability is there.
That makes a lot of sense. When I was working in for an aftermarket distributor, I loved to bring manufacturer reps out to the field so we could go visit these independent fleets and repair shops and really talk about what was going on on the ground level. And this was kind of a two-way thing, because on the one hand, we were able to give a lot of info to my customers who desperately needed it. On the other hand, it allowed the manufacturers to actually get real world feedback from what's going on with the independents. Now, Kevin, I want to throw this over to you. How important right now in 2020 is parts availability? We're talking about, Daniel really did a great job of laying out how things have expanded in the number of parts you need to stock. When it comes to availability, I know this might sound like an obvious question, but let's dig into it.
Yeah, it's a very great question, and to piggyback off of some of what Daniel said, it's really the key driver to being able to make sure that we have uptime. And uptime is, everybody's heard it. Everybody's preached, we're the best at uptime. We'll make sure that your trucks are only down as long as they need to be repaired. But it's true. If you look at the way that these vehicles run, they're utility vehicles. They are made to make money. And if they're not making money, they're not doing their jobs, and you're losing money. Every day that you're not out there driving that truck, you are losing money on that vehicle, especially if you are a small fleet and you owe money on that vehicle. So parts availability is just one of the key pieces surrounding around making sure that that truck can be on the road as fast as possible after a breakdown, a service event, or anything like that. So making sure that parts are where they need to be and to make sure that they're available for those trucks is really was a big challenge for the aftermarket. And now we're really starting to catch up. We've broken ground in the past couple of years where we've been able to start decoding VIN numbers. We've been able to look and see, what vehicles are in what geographic area based on their VIN numbers. And it's really attested to, the work that we've been putting in with the independent distributors in the market, as well as the service providers. And like you said, boots on the ground, being in the shop is the best place to find, the real world information about how to service your customers. And knowing what their needs are when it comes to parts availability helped us kind of drive the tools that we're putting together to help the aftermarket catch up to the OE. 5 years ago, you can't take a VIN number and get anything off of it. If in the aftermarket, it couldn't happen. We didn't have that capability. But now, we have diesel laptops and OmniVIN and multiple companies out there that are starting to, be able to break down these VIN numbers for use in the aftermarket and for people who don't have dealer abilities or dealer connections to get that information. And what that really comes back to is being able to have the information of what trucks are in what part of the country, and also knowing what those trucks are, helps us be able to guide and steer all of our independent distributors into knowing what parts to keep in their stores. If you take a look at Joe's truck supply, say in Boise, Idaho, and you ask him, hey, what's the stretch on your customers? And he says, basically about 50-mile circle around our store. Perfect. Well, with the tools that we have now in the aftermarket, we can throw a net 50 miles around your location and know every single truck that's registered in that area. And with that information, that store owner can also look at that information and be like, yeah, well, we see a lot of these that are on that list. We see a lot of these that are on that list. And they can work with their independent distributor, say, hey, these are a lot of what we work on. So let's go back and look at the parts that your distributors have and match that to what's in our area. And that's really the key driver in how to make sure that parts are available quickly, to make sure that they can get to the service shop on time, to make sure that that truck can get repaired and put back on the road when it needs to.
First of all, I love Joe from Boise, Idaho. Good guy, great guy.
He's a great guy.
But what you're saying is really important, because like I said, when I worked for an aftermarket distributor, we would have manufacturers supply us with a recommended inventory list. Mm-hmm. And that was based on national averages. And the problem with that was, like in the area that I worked in northern Alberta, you wouldn't find an International or a Volvo in the oil patch. Guys in our area, they drive Western Stars, they drive Kenworths and Peterbilts, and sometimes some Macs.
Yep.
And so the problem was, we'd end up with all this Volvo stuff, international parts, up in our mezzanine. And then by the time it became obsolete inventory, we'd lost the right to return it. and it became completely frozen capital that we then had to somehow liquidate. And usually it was more expensive to liquidate it, so it just took up space in our warehouse, which reduced the ability for us to stock enough parts to cover the trucks that were in our area. So Kevin, what you're touching on, man, does that ever strike a chord with me? That is so important.
Absolutely.
And that's a great thing. I was just listening to your podcast the other day talking about that in the frozen capital. I mean, the tools that are out there now, I mean, we can take what Kevin was just saying from a geography standpoint. And if, say, an independent service center or a distributor in Boise, Idaho, say they're focused only on the construction market, we can then overlay a filter onto that and take out all vehicles that aren't in that channel. Right. So, I mean, the tools and abilities now that exist in the aftermarket to focus down to the right parts at the right time is critical. And your question around availability, I mean, especially within service, I mean, that's everything. And it's a real challenge because unless you know the exact right parts to have, I mean, look, replacement parts don't turn like friction and fluids, right? I can buy pallets and truckloads of DEF fluid and I'm going to turn that inventory. But if I buy a trailer of replacement parts and only 30% of them are what, is actually servicing in my area, and everybody in the area doesn't think they're available in the aftermarket, all I'm doing is sitting on frozen capital. So you're exactly right. I mean, trying to understand to a hyper local level what's needed and then making sure it's available. And finally, Dorman's got, boots on the ground across the country, solely focused on driving that awareness. So, we're really focused on trying to bridge that gap in terms of getting that exact right parts available into that local market and then pulling that through down to the fleet or the independent service level.
In our preparation for today's conversation, we talked a little bit, Daniel, about why independents feel that they maybe have been ignored a little bit. And I wanted to give you some context on that. So when I did research before starting the Heavy Duty Parts Report, I interviewed a lot of mechanics, repair shop owners, fleet maintenance managers. They all said the same thing. If you work at a dealership, you have so many resources available to you. In fact, you have so many resources, you can't even keep up with all of them. But the minute you leave that environment and you go into the independent, everybody's left to their own devices. And so it's great to talk about how that's changing. Maybe what you could do is you could give us context on how we got where we are and then what's changing and what is the implications going forward.
It's a great question and a really great, way you've put that in terms of the context of what's changing. And let's be honest, things have changed and are changing incredibly fast. Aftermarket distribution is quickly changing from this old maintenance parts type world, right? Fluids and friction, and quickly it's becoming a replacement parts business. But I think the challenge here, you mentioned about the independent service channel feeling a little bit ignored. That's a really interesting topic here. And I really see the challenge there as sort of a bit of a structural challenge driven by both the supply and the demand side. And so when I say the supply side, what I'm really meaning there is the distributor, the supplier of the parts in the market. So, you go work for a distributor as a new outside salesperson, and you're given a list of, fleets in the area and, how many vehicles they have, and you're going to go out. And one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to show up at those fleets and you're going to canvass them and ask for what kind of vehicles they have on the lot. What are you guys running? So you can build up the right kind of parts for that fleet. Right. But that's a fleet target, right? And at the end of the day, you can predict what parts are needed based on that makeup and how often they're needed and try to gauge what you should actually stock in your store. Right. That's the traditional model from the supply side. And that model, I think, is structurally challenged to think about the independent service center, right, who may be running a whole lot more vehicles through there on a per day basis. That model just structurally is challenged to try to think about the independent service side. And then from the demand side, the actual parts pull for who's needing it, an independent service, as we started to talk before, is just so different in what their needs are from a real large fleet. Again, a large fleet is going to have their own, technicians. They're going to have their own parts room. They've got dealer level service. They've got, all these tools at their disposal to understand what parts they're going to need. And they're probably going to stock them themselves. And on top of that, they can afford to put a truck down for 2 days while they wait for, a low turning part to come in through a supply chain. But that's not true for an independent service center, right? I don't know what's coming in today. I get a truck up on the lift this morning, and I need that truck off in 2 hours. Kevin was telling me a great story. He was having a challenge today, and this is a little different because this was for him to try on some parts, but he needed to get a battery onto a truck. And he knew that last night. He found out when he was prepping for his work today, called an aftermarket distributor, wanted to have that part available. No problem. We'll have the battery first thing in the morning for you. It's a battery, right? So, this morning, 9, 10 o'clock, doesn't have the battery delivered yet. 11 o'clock, he follows up. Well, we're going to have it for you sometime this morning. Well, he could afford to wait because he could do something else. But if I was an independent service center, I've canceled the order already, called the dealer, bought the battery, and gotten the truck off the lift, right? So there's just not the same type of ability for an independent service center whose primary responsibility is to service that other customer's vehicle and get it off the lift. And that's a real challenge. And let's be honest here, right? This focus on big fleets, there's a real dynamic here in consolidation. And I don't want to undersell that, right? I mean, it's real. And there's a number of big fleets who are doing a phenomenal job at really moving the needle in terms of consolidating, on highway transportation and distribution. But with all that said, I mean, there's still 90% of vehicles are owned by someone with less than 10 trucks. You own less than 10 trucks. You don't have a tech. You don't have a parts room. Maybe you have a bay and a part-time guy or a mobile guy showing up to do some friction and wheel end and stuff like that. But everything else is going to an independent service guy or it's going to a dealer. And I need that truck back ASAP, as Kevin said. I mean, uptime's everything. So the demand side from what the independent service channel needs is just so different, right? They need the part now. And I think structurally that's going to always sort of be a challenge unless you can hyper-local predict those exact sensor and ECU. I mean, all these complicated things that only fail once in a while. Until you can predict exactly what those needs are going to be in that local environment, that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, and it's just going to be complicated by the advancement in different electronic technology. I think of Dana's, really, we had them on the podcast a little while ago. They're really excited about the electronic differentials and rear ends. Mm-hmm. But when you're in the oil patch and something goes on one of those, I mean, that's a completely different, or you're a logger or you're in construction and you're not, that's just a completely different world than the aftermarket parts distribution channel has ever had to deal with. And so that's going to complicate things. So yeah, I think the emergence of these different technologies to be able to help us predict is going to be critical to really being able to keep this thing moving forward and making it so that it isn't a situation where only the truck OEs are able to service those customers because it's become too complex.
Yeah, agreed.
You're listening to the Heavy Duty Parts Report. I'm your host, Jamie Irvin, and we've been speaking with Daniel and Kevin from Dorman Products. We're having a great conversation, kind of giving us an assessment of where we are in 2020 and where we're going to go. Kevin, why do OE truck dealers have as much as 90% market share on categories like after treatment?
It's a great question, and it's an extremely true statement. After treatment's one of those things that, 10 years ago, even 12 years ago, we barely had to deal with it. We had EGR at the worst. And EGR was, when it was just an EGR, it was easy to manage. It was a new technology on these vehicles, but it wasn't overly complicated to deal with. But now over the years, we've added DPFs, DOCs, SCRs, DEF systems, enhanced EGR systems, VGT turbos, and there's a lot of parts in those systems. They're very, very technologically advanced now, and they come with their own computers. They have a sensor to detect everything. And they also have multiple hard part components that have to function within those systems. And what's really tough is that the aftermarket, just like in any other aspect of the aftermarket, it's taken years for us to catch up to make sure that we have these parts made and available for the aftermarket. But on top of that, being able to have them available to those distributors is the whole next step. And what happens when it comes to the dealer is, we've touched on this before. They have all of the capabilities already preset in place for these things. That it's done by design. The dealers and the OEs, they know these are the technologies we're putting out, and these are the different assets that we need to put in these dealerships to maintain these systems. So they're ahead of the game off the start. So they have the computers, they have the software, they have the trained techs, they have the parts already on their shelf. They don't really have to worry too much about, all makes coming in their doors, because primarily they're working on whatever their proprietary make is in that shop. And now they're even starting to come out with all makes programs, so they can start catering to anything else that fleet may have that they have as a customer. So it's very easy for them to hold that market share. But as in any market, and as in any category in the aftermarket and in trucking in general, we're catching up. We're creating our own resources. Diesel Laptops is doing a phenomenal job of not just bringing together one aspect with the computers, but they're making the truck parts cross. They're making the parts look up. They're creating all these different systems to help the aftermarket and to help the individual service providers kind of round the corner in having availability of the information. So, that 90% market share now is going to start moving its way down and down and down for the dealer as we start introducing all these new tools to the market. So it's one of those things that system's created by design by the OEMs, and they're the ones who designed it. So it's easy for them to have that market share. But like we said, the aftermarket, we pick up quickly, we build the tools, and we're putting them out. And we're trying to put them out with our boots on the ground at Dorman. I know Diesel Laptops has boots on the ground. We're trying to get in the shops of the end users as well as in our distributors to make sure that everybody has the information and tools available to capture these markets.
I think with categories like after treatment too, historically, you would see long runs where the same technology was used year after year after year. So after about the first 3 years and the truck comes off of warranty, the aftermarket was ready. They would, they had that 3-year window. They could, it's not that different, right? The S-Cam is a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, right? Maybe the big change was, oh my goodness, we went from Q to Q plus brake shoes, right? But with after treatment, you have government regulation mandating that and really pushing the limits of technology. And so there's this constant change. Like even the truck OEs are having a hard time keeping up. So the aftermarket is like, well, we just got this figured out and everything's changing again. And so is that trend going to continue when we add in all the additional complexity of big data and electronics into trucks?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the more aspects that we throw into that category, the more complicated and diluted it gets, I guess. Where there's always the next piece. The EPA is there, and all the agencies that are working on this. They're going to keep wanting more. They're going to keep wanting better. They're going to keep pushing for progression. So that's just going to keep making us have to, go from being, for a long time we were reactive to all this, and now, with the internet helps, people who can research help, and really knowing what's coming, being a part of, things like TMC and seeing where the industry's moving. Those kind of things are helping us, keep an eye on the future and kind of starting to prepare ourselves how to catch up to these markets and to make sure that we are ready, when these new technologies are coming out. And it's really a combination effort of, researching the systems, researching the market, researching the vehicles, and researching what kind of parts are being used. And that really goes across all categories. I feel like not just after treatment, but being able to really do the due diligence of preparing ourselves for what's coming next is really what's important to keeping us on track as best as we can for what the emerging technologies that are coming.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So you say that, is it going to continue? I mean, the EPA is already meeting and talking about the next level of particulate matter reductions, right? And they're working on fuel economy improvements. So, you're probably going to be working turbos harder in the future as you increase pressures and temperatures. So, I mean, it's all going to change. I mean, as you have continued particulate matter reductions, you're going to have more PM sensors. This whole thing is going to continue to drive complexity. And then you asked about, sort of some of what's driving some of the dealer side. And I still think a lot of it's availability. Everything in the after treatment, if it fails, it shuts the truck down, right? D-rate. And I mean, that's the scariest thing for a fleet, right? I mean, my truck's D-rated. I'm on the side of the road until I'm limping to a center, a dealership, or I'm getting picked up by a tow truck. So not only the cost of getting moved, but all that downtime. So ultimately, here I am. If I have a part within after treatment, almost any part fail. It's a big problem. So I think there's a feeling and a bit of an awareness and a hesitation to head to the aftermarket for that. And hopefully, as fleets start to test this and try it out and see that the aftermarket has the parts and the availability, and that they're not, increasing risk of any kind of D rates and stuff like that, that'll continue to snowball.
So, Daniel, how is Dorman connecting really aftermarket distribution with independent service channels?
Yeah, that's a great question. Appreciate the sort of shameless pitch opportunity here. So,
Got to give you at least one every episode.
Much appreciated. I think we've really touched a little bit on all these pieces here already. But I'd say it's really a combination of boots on the ground and our technological tools. So, we've talked about, from a technology side, this investment in cataloging. So, we have the ability to take a fleet, and based on fleet name alone, we can predict exactly what vehicles they have by VIN. And, with the Auto Care Association just this month, finally has released standards for heavy duty. So heavy duty vehicles are now cataloged within the ACA by ACES and PIs, and they're going to start pushing for parts and products to be cataloged to those year, make, and models. Now, Dorman, as you mentioned, being a traditional legacy automotive aftermarket company, we've been focused within ACES and PIs and meeting those standards for 30 years now. So one of the things that we've done from the beginning is that we have all of our products cataloged down to year, make, and model, and what that actual vehicle ID is. So when we decode a VIN, it's not just a matter of saying, this VIN you have is, this year, make, model with this engine, and then you can go yourself and look up the parts. We have all of our parts cataloged to that exact year, make, model. So we can take a fleet and say, okay, based on your fleet, we know that you have these VINs. We can decode those VINs down to year, make, model, and create a catalog that the only thing in that catalog is the relevant parts for those exact vehicles. And that happens automatically. We've made a big investment to have that happen. That entire process is seamless. But then a step further, we can take all the fleets in a geography, as we said, whether that's a distributor or it's an independent service center, and we can put a lasso on a 30-mile radius around an independent service center and say, here's all the vehicles domiciled in this region, this 30-mile radius. And based on that year, make, model of all those VINs, here's the exact parts that are applicable to those exact vehicles. So we can get hyper local in that. And then with the boots on the ground, tying that all together, we can start to try to bridge that gap between the fleet awareness or the independent service awareness of these are the trucks in my area or these are the parts that my fleet will need, and work hand in hand between the fleet and aftermarket distribution, because we're incredibly supportive and committed to aftermarket distribution, and work hand in hand with the chosen distributor to make sure that those parts are available. And from there, then, since they know what the other vehicles are, now they have targets to go out there and sell that. So there's not, like most complex issues here, there is not a push a button and fix this. But independent service is such an interesting channel. We always look at fleets and we're going after big fleets and mega fleets. But if I look at, I was just having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with someone, and we said some backhand math. And I said, if you took an independent service center, with 12 bays, right? It's a good size service center, and they're turning that bay twice a day, right? And they do that 5 days a week. That's something like 6,000 plus vehicles running through that service center a year. That's a mega fleet by any standard. But it's really challenging. There's not a one-stop solution to predicting what 6,000 vehicles they are, what parts they're going to need, and then making sure they're available. Because the worst thing to do is say, we think it's going to be these 6,000, make sure a whole bunch of parts are available because you need to have availability, and then a distributor is just sitting on a bunch of obsolete inventory. So trying to close that loop, get hyper-local, and get the boots on the ground to get that awareness that these parts are available and get them pulled out the door is really where we're focused.
So in conclusion, Kevin, if there's one thing you'd like to leave our viewers and listeners, what's that one thing?
I would say, don't give up on the aftermarket. Just because, you call the dealer and you pay the dealer prices and you're used to working with the dealer, the aftermarket's catching up, and we're going to keep working, we're going to keep chugging, and we're going to keep making new tools available to help everyone in the independent service provider channels, as well as the independent distributors. We have a piece of the market share and we want to keep growing it. So, anytime that you want to do better for your business or try and, put some more money in the bottom line, aftermarket is not just some cheap white box part anymore. It's not, what you're buying off of eBay. The aftermarket's really putting its time and due diligence into making quality parts and making them affordable. Dorman's been doing it for 100 years on the automotive side. And, we're only getting better and we're only getting more advanced at what we're doing. So these parts that we're making, they go through rigorous testing and they're really being vetted out to make sure that these are quality parts at an affordable price. It's really about the bottom line and uptime on these vehicles. And we're really doing everything we can to try and make sure that those goals are met for our customers.
Daniel?
Sort of tying on what Kevin said, think of the aftermarket and Dorman specifically, we're hyper focused as ever on really expanding the scope and size of the aftermarket, one new part at a time. I look back at the legacy and, Dorman, the whole idea was founded because, one of the original founders looked at a handle, a window crank handle, and it was a dealer only part. And he's like, this is crazy. You can't get this anywhere but the dealer. It's a plastic handle, and tooled it up and sort of that created an entire category. And, we've now grown from there, to continue to look for parts that are exclusively available at the dealer. Now naturally that creates challenges for us. We're always going to be fighting the battle that we're looking at a category that, was only available at the dealer. So we've got to spend the time to make the awareness that these are available in the aftermarket. But we're as focused as ever, light duty, medium duty, heavy duty markets, expanding that scope. Really one part by one part, to think that, at the beginning of this, it was a window handle and now it's VGT actuators and knock sensors and DEF driver modules and things like that. I mean, anything that you thought that is going to be dealer only, if it's a high failure part or a part that's hard to find, Dorman has probably already looked at it or we're working on it now. And we hope you'll give the aftermarket a chance and reach out to us if it's a part that you seem to, have a hard time finding.
You've been listening to the Heavy Duty Parts Report. I'm your host, Jamie Irvin. Today, we have been talking with Daniel Simon, Product Manager, and Kevin Smith, Heavy Duty Field Analyst at Dorman Products. To learn more, go to dormanproducts.com. Links are in the show notes. Daniel, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Kevin, always a good time talking to you. Thank you again.
Good seeing you again, Jamie.
Have you subscribed to our weekly email yet? Go to jamieirvin.ca/email and subscribe today. Never miss out on any content or great deals again. Go to jamieirvin.ca/email and subscribe today. I'd like to remind everyone to focus on cost per mile over purchase price and let's keep those trucks and trailers rolling. You can watch our next video and don't forget, subscribe to the YouTube channel.